Before I say anything else, I really just want to acknowledge how incredibly fortunate I've been. For more than a decade, I've had the rare privilege of moving through the mountains, climbing and skiing, guiding others there, and I wouldn't trade those experiences for anything. There's been sunrise and sunset from a sleeping bag, bathing in an alpine lake. It's a little chilly. Living in a car, digging camp in the rain, being above the clouds, feeling small in huge spaces, feeling triumphant, climbing rocks, climbing ice, climbing rock and snow, climbing with skis, skiing big, steep lines, summiting, sharing the camaraderie of a team that you trust. My favorite part, getting to take a nap when it's all over. I'll be honest, I think the mountains are rad, totally awesome, and I hope in some small way I've convinced you the same thing. But the mountains aren't without risk. See, in my line of work, I frequently get asked how I can do things like backcountry skiing or alpine climbing when they're so dangerous. But I think at the heart of that question is really operating in a risky environment under conditions of uncertainty. But that describes life in general, right? Should you start that business? Should you get married? Should you run for office? Will eating those chili cheese fries wreck your afternoon? We all have decisions like this to face. And those sort of decisions come up a lot for me. So I'd like to explore a few examples. So we're at the top of the line. Should you drop in and ski it? I mean, it looks pretty rad, right? But there's a lot to consider. What's my skiing ability? How steep is the terrain? What's the snowpack doing? How likely is an avalanche? What's the weather doing? Right? And there's probably some pretty obvious, explicit physical risks that you're thinking about in your mind here. Maybe things like falling, hypothermia, heat stroke, sunburn, falling off a cliff, rocks falling off that cliff onto you, the ever-present risk of violent snowy death by asphyxiation in an avalanche, right? A typical day in the office for me. And you may be thinking, that's totally crazy, and it has nothing to do with your life. But I guarantee you it does, because you take risk every day too. You just might not think of it that way. It's a little more implicit, right? If you live in the United States, there's a good chance you've driven in a car before. And when you get in that car, you might think, I'm gonna get some groceries, or I'm gonna go to work. But you're not necessarily thinking about that you might die in a fiery car crash that day because the person in the car next to you was texting, right? But we engage with risk every day, all day. And that's okay. Now, of course, we also need to consider the bigger picture. This is Ben Lomond, a peak you might recognize being right here in Ogden, Utah. In fact, you can see it outside. And that line we're looking at skis down the south face of this peak. It descends 4,000 vertical feet. There's variable snowpack, there's patches of ice, there's cliffs, there's trees, there's avalanches. There are a lot of hazards to identify and to mitigate. And those hazards, if you don't address them, can cost you life and limb. And that can make you justifiably afraid. And that is a good thing. See, fear is a useful force in these situations, because fear is how I know, right here in my gut, that I'm about to take a risk. Right? Fear makes me ask good questions, like what if the business fails? What if I get injured? Right? What if those chili cheese fries really do wreck my afternoon? But we can't be paralyzed by fear, right? If we're paralyzed by fear, we never get anything done. At some point, if you want the reward, you have to take the risk. And the bigger the risk, the bigger the reward. Now, when you think about risk, you probably fall into one of two categories. Either you're the type of person who's like really gung-ho and psyched and likes to go for it and adventurous, or maybe the type of person who's a little more reserved and cautious and careful and like to sit back and see how things play out. Both are perfectly valid. But if you're the type who likes to go for it, and I'm right there with you, you may have illusory superiority bias, which means that you have more confidence than you have competence. In other words, you don't know what you don't know. See, when we're gonna go ski this line, you think you're gonna look like this. But in reality, you look like this. Now, if you're the cautious type, that comes with its own problems, right? Because if you never take the risk in the first place, you miss all the opportunities. If you never take the chance, how are you going to get the rewards? So I think there's room in our lives for practice risk-taking in whatever it is you want to do. But not just like any kind of practice. We need deliberate practice. Deliberate practice is different from regular practice in two important ways. The first is that it intentionally pushes your limits. You stretch your comfort zone every time that you practice because you have a specific goal that you want to reach. And the second is that you need accurate feedback. You need to be practicing the right things. So how much practice do you need? Well, Malcolm Gladwell published a book called Outliers that popularized the notion that you need 10,000 hours of practice to become an expert. And there's some debate about how true that is, but I think that 10,000 hour rule is a good benchmark. So if you're doing it as a full-time job, that should take you about 5 years. But if it's something you're doing as a hobby, on the side, a few hours a week, what have you, then it could take you 20 years or more. You're going to have to be disciplined and consistent for this to work. Here's an example of that kind of practice in the mountains where I hang out. This is my friend Nathan. He's sliding down a snow slope, and he's going to use his ice axe to stop himself from going any further. Now, we call that process self-arresting. And when you first learn this process, it's very deliberate. You have to think about it a lot. So because first you have to get your body reoriented so that you're belly first on the snow, and then you have to assume this kind of crouch position, feet down, butt back, and then you got to put your ice axe in the right spot, and you got to leverage into it and apply some pressure. And of course, you got to turn your head to the side so you don't accidentally stab yourself in the face. All of that takes time and effort and energy. And while you're doing all those things, you're sliding down a snow slope. Right? You're picking up speed, and if you pick up enough speed, you don't get to stop at all. And when that happens, you go careening down the slope and hit whatever's at the bottom with bone-shattering force. And because we have very fragile, squishy bodies as people, you don't really tend to enjoy that experience. Now, in this case, Nathan will be fine. There's nothing to hit at the bottom. This, however, as you can imagine, is a pretty terrible place to learn this skill, right? Because there's thousands of feet of vertical drop behind Josh there. There's cliffs underneath them that you can't see in the photo, and there's big crevasses, the giant cracks in the glacier down below. Bad place to learn. Before you get to this place, you need to have this skill totally dialed, super practiced. So back to Nathan. As he slides down and climbs back up, over time, this skill will become automatic. He won't have to think about it. He'll just, boom, self-arrest. He stops. He can keep on climbing. Of course, when we practice this skill, we need to make sure that we're practicing the right things. Right? Practice doesn't do us any good if we practice the wrong things. To achieve that, we need feedback. And we get feedback from kind learning environments, like whitewater kayaking. Now, when you screw up whitewater kayaking, you learn that you've done so in ways that are cold and wet and dark and loud and violent and kind of scary, and surprisingly absent of the oxygen that you're so accustomed to breathing. And that provides clear and immediate feedback that you messed up, and you should probably do something different next time. Backcountry skiing, on the other hand, is a little more devious. Right? These angular snow crystals here, they indicate that the slope could avalanche. But just because those snow crystals are present in the snowpack doesn't mean that it will avalanche. And you can see where that's tricky. See, because you could ski a slope dozens of times thinking you've done everything right, but actually had a series of close calls. And you don't learn that until it finally avalanches. And if you haven't learned the lesson yet, you're likely in that avalanche. The price for this lesson might be your life. That's really harsh. And in those cases, experiential education is not the way to go. We need to get feedback in other ways. We talk to experts in the field. We review the data. We analyze accident reports. And we get feedback from our partners. I was climbing this line recently, up the rock, and you step off the overhanging rock onto the suspended dagger of ice. And that move from the rock to the ice, that can be kind of tricky. So I called down to my partner. He'd been climbing ice for 18 years. I was like, hey, what are your thoughts? He's like, I got nothing, man. You're on your own. I've only ever seen people do stuff like that in pictures. But it looks rad. 18 years, right? Experience is not the same thing as expertise. I'd also be remiss if I failed to mention the role of luck in all of this. The fact that I'm even giving this talk is evidence of survivorship bias. You're not hearing these words from the people who got hurt or quit or went broke or died while they were climbing or skiing or mountain guiding, right? Those things are risky. There's an irreducible amount of uncertainty inherent in mountain travel as there is in all of life. We have to accept that, right? Sometimes you do everything right, and the outcome is still poor because there's risk involved. See, I topped out this climb, and then I caught a big chunk of ice with my face. Now, if I screwed up, my face deserves to look like that, and I need to accept those consequences, right? I need to humbly learn the lessons involved. But if I did everything right and my face still looks like that, well, that's what it means to take risks. Sometimes you lose, and you have to be okay with that. So do you drop in? What are the consequences? How likely are they? Have you put in the practice? Do you have the skills? What are the rewards? Only you know the answer to those questions. But at the end of the day, it's really, really straightforward. Without risk, there is no reward. But in this case, The rewards were totally sweet. Thank you.